The territory of modern Estonia became suitable for settlement about 11,000 years ago, when the last glacier retreated. The first hunter-gatherers appeared here around 9,000 years before the Common Era, migrating from the south along the Baltic Sea coast. These groups belonged to Finno-Ugric peoples and moved in small family communities, seeking new hunting grounds. In winter they crossed frozen lakes and bays. In summer they used primitive boats for coastal travel. Archaeological excavations near Pärnu have revealed Mesolithic period sites with bones of seals, elk, and wild boars. Finds of stone axes and arrowheads show that these people had advanced stoneworking technology. Particularly interesting are polished axes made from local granite, dated to 6,000 to 4,000 years before the Common Era. Their quality indicates labour specialisation and possible exchange between groups. The transition to a productive economy occurred late compared to Central Europe. Agriculture appeared in Estonian lands only around 3,000 years before the Common Era, due to the unfavourable climate and poor soils. Early farmers grew barley and rye, and raised pigs, cows and sheep. However, hunting and fishing remained important food sources throughout the Bronze Age. The culture of stone cairns, which developed between 2,000 and 500 years before the Common Era, demonstrates social differentiation. These burial structures, especially numerous on the island of Saaremaa, contained grave goods, bronze ornaments, pottery, and stone tools. In some burials, amber beads were found, indicating trade contacts. Amber was the main export commodity of the Proto-Baltic peoples and was highly valued in the Roman Empire and the Near East. In the first centuries of the Common Era, several tribal alliances existed in Estonia. Written sources mention the Rebellions in the Tallinn area, Saaremaa people on Saaremaa Island, Ugandians on the mainland, and others. These groups spoke dialects of the Baltic Finnic language, shared common religious beliefs, but were not politically unified. Power belonged to tribal elders, who governed through councils of seniors. Roman coins from the 1st through 3rd centuries, found on Saaremaa and elsewhere, confirm the participation of Estonian tribes in trade along the Amber Road. Roman authors mention the Esti tribes on the southeastern Baltic coast, though it is unclear whether these were ancestors of the Estonians or Baltic tribes. Trade occurred through intermediaries, mainly Gothic and other Germanic tribes. From the 8th century, the Viking Age began, profoundly influencing the region. Scandinavian sagas refer to Iceland as a land rich in goods and suitable for raids. Estonians suffered attacks from Swedish and Danish Vikings seeking slaves, silver, and provisions. However, Estonians were not passive victims. Chronicles and sagas record Estonian pirate raids on the Swedish coast. The most famous episode is the Saaremaa people's attack on the Swedish city of Sigtuna in 1187. According to Scandinavian sources, the Estonians burned the city and killed the local archbishop. This weakened Sigtuna so much that it lost its trading importance in favour of Stockholm. Estonian pirates used light rowing vessels adapted for quick raids in coastal waters. From the east, Slavic principalities pressured Estonian lands. Novgorod and Pskov chronicles from the 11th through 12th centuries mention campaigns against the Chud, a collective name for Baltic Finnic peoples. Novgorod princes tried to collect tribute from southeastern Estonian lands, but their control was unstable. Estonians regularly responded with raids on Novgorod and Pskov territories. These conflicts were not systematic wars for territory. They had the character of seasonal raids for booty, cattle, grain, captives. Estonian tribes did not seek to create a centralized state or seize Slavic lands. Their military organization was based on militias of free landowners who gathered for defense or attack under tribal leaders. By the 12th century, Estonian lands had about 8-10 tribal territories with fortified hill forts. These fortresses were built on natural hills and reinforced with ramparts of stone and wood. The Iru hill fort near Tallinn, well studied by archaeologists, had a wooden wall on a stone foundation, residential buildings inside and storage facilities. Such hill forts served as administrative centres, places for tax collection and religious ceremonies. Estonian paganism was a polytheistic system with a cult of natural forces. The chief deity was Taira, the god of thunder and war, often compared to the Scandinavian Thor. Sacred groves in forests were sites for sacrifices. Estonians sacrificed livestock, poured beer on stones, and sometimes, according to later Christian chroniclers, sacrificed captives. Religious rituals were conducted by priests who also served as diviners and healers. Unlike Rus or Scandinavia, where there were professional retinues and princely administrations, Estonian society remained tribal with a relatively egalitarian structure. The absence of strong centralised power made Estonians mobile in local conflicts, but vulnerable to organised external invasions. The economy was based on slash-and-burn agriculture, animal husbandry, fishing and hunting. Estonians grew rye, barley, oats, flax and hemp. Crafts developed: blacksmithing, pottery, woodworking and leatherworking. Iron ore was obtained from bog ores, enabling local production of tools and weapons. Trade was mainly by barter. Monetary economy was absent until the arrival of German merchants. Climatic conditions in the 10th through 12th centuries were more favourable than in previous eras. The medieval warm period allowed for expanded sown areas and increased livestock numbers. Estonia's population by the beginning of the 13th century is estimated at about 150,000–180,000 people, a relatively large figure for this region. At the end of the 12th century, Estonian lands faced the threat of a new type of invasion. In the 1180s, German merchants established trading posts at the mouth of the Daugava, modern Latvia. Merchants were followed by missionaries led by Meinhard of Segeberg, who in 1186 became the first bishop of Livonia. Attempts to Christianize the local population met resistance, leading to calls for a crusade. In 1193, Pope Celestine III issued a bull equating crusades to the Baltic with those to the Holy Land. This meant that warriors participating in the Christianization of Baltic pagans received the same indulgences as crusaders to Jerusalem. For German knighthood, this was an opportunity to gain lands, glory and salvation. In 1202, the Sword Brothers Order was created specifically for the conquest and Christianization of the Baltic. Estonian tribes, divided and unprepared for confrontation with an organized military force backed by the resources of the Holy Roman Empire, stood on the brink of catastrophe. Their world of autonomous tribal territories, pagan sacred groves and seasonal wars with neighbours was destined to disappear within a few decades under the pressure of crusaders, Danish troops and German colonization. The German conquest of Estonia began in 1208, when Livonian crusaders invaded the territory of the Ugandians. Unlike previous Viking or Slavic raids, this was a systematic campaign aimed at complete colonization. The Sword Brothers Order, founded in 1202, operated in close coordination with Bishop Albert of Riga, who controlled the trade infrastructure and diplomatic ties with Germany. Estonian tribes put up fierce resistance. In 1210, the combined forces of the Rebellions and Saaremaa people attacked German garrisons but lost the battle near Viljandi. The Order's knights had a decisive advantage in armament, heavy armoured cavalry against infantry with spears and bows. Estonian hill forts, built for defence against similar tribal forces, could not withstand the Crusaders' siege engines. In 1217, the Estonians appealed for help to the Novgorod Prince Mstislav the Bold. He led an army to Tallinn and tried to assist the local population, but his expedition proved unsuccessful. The Novgorodians were not interested in a prolonged war with the well-organised order and soon retreated. This left the Estonians alone against the Crusaders. In 1219, Denmark intervened in the conflict. King Valdemarseke landed with a fleet on the northern coast and founded a fortress on the site of modern Tallinn, which he named Revel. According to legend, it was here, during a battle with the Estonians, that the Danish flag Dannebrog fell from the sky. The Danes occupied northern Estonia, while the Sword Brothers Order controlled the central and southern territories. The island of Saaremaa remained unconquered the longest, until 1227. The Saaremaa people offered the fiercest resistance. Their island position provided a strategic advantage, and the tradition of piracy supplied experienced seafarers. In 1222, they conducted a large-scale raid on the Livonian coast, burning several German settlements. The order organised a punitive expedition, and in 1227, after a long siege, the main Saaremaa hill fort capitulated. Under the terms of the treaty, the Saaremaa people had to accept baptism and pay tribute, but in practice, uprisings continued for another decade. The largest uprising erupted in 1343 on St. George's Night, April 23–24, from which comes the name St. George's Uprising. Estonian peasants attacked German fortresses, killing several Order brothers and Danish administrators. The uprising particularly engulfed the island of Saaremaa and mainland northern Estonia. The rebels destroyed churches, returned to pagan rituals, and proclaimed the restoration of pre-Christian orders. The order brutally suppressed the uprising within a year. The Danish crown, exhausted by the costs of quelling the revolt, sold its Estonian possessions to the Teutonic Order in 1346 for 19,000 marks of silver. This united all mainland Estonia under the rule of one organisation, from then on the Livonian Order, which emerged after the merger of the Sword Brothers with the Teutonic Order in 1237. The Livonian state had a specific structure. It was not a centralised monarchy but a federation of several political entities. The Livonian Order controlled most of the territory. The bishoprics, Riga, Dorpat, Özelviek, had autonomy, and cities that were members of the Hanseatic League enjoyed self-governance. Tallinn and Tartu became important Hanseatic centres. Tallinn flourished as a trading port. The city received Lübeck law in 1248 and became a mediator in trade between Novgorod and Western Europe. Through Tallinn passed Russian goods, furs, wax, flax to the west, and back came cloth, salt, herring, and wine. Hanseatic merchants built stone houses in the lower town, while the order's administration and Danish aristocracy controlled the upper town with the Toompea fortress. German colonisation created a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were the order's knights and German aristocratic landowners. The middle stratum consisted of urban burghers, predominantly German-speaking merchants and artisans. Estonian peasants found themselves at the lowest rung as serfs. They had no right to own land, changed their place of residence without the lord's permission, and their obligations constantly increased. The manorial system was based on manors, large estates where peasants worked on the lord's land several days a week and spent the rest of the time cultivating their own plots. By the 14th century, corvée averaged 2 to 3 days a week, but in subsequent centuries it increased to 4 to 6 days. Peasants also paid natural taxes in grain, livestock, and forest products. The church played a key role in Germanization. Sermons were conducted in German, services in Latin. The Estonian language remained the language of the peasants, without literacy or literature. Priests were Germans who often did not know Estonian and used interpreters. The church tithe became an additional burden for the peasant population. The plague of 1349–1350 struck Livonia as harshly as the rest of Europe. Tallinn lost about a third of its population. The consequences were contradictory. Mass mortality created a labour shortage, which theoretically should have strengthened the peasants' position, but in reality, the knights tightened serfdom to prevent escapes. Deceased German landowners were replaced by new colonists from Germany. In the 15th century, the Livonian Order reached the zenith of its power. Grandmaster Walter von Plettenberg, 1494–1535, modernised the army, built new fortresses, and successfully repelled Russian invasions. In 1501–1503, the Moscow Prince Ivan III attempted to capture Livonia, but the Order, in alliance with Lithuania, halted the advance. Plettenberg became the most revered master in the Order's history. However, internal contradictions grew. The Reformation, which began in Germany in 1517, quickly spread to Livonia. Tallinn adopted Lutheranism in 1524 after iconoclastic riots, when crowds smashed Catholic churches and monasteries. Tartu and other cities followed suit. The Order, formerly a Catholic organisation, found itself in an ideological crisis. Many knights sympathised with Protestantism, but betraying Catholicism would mean losing legitimacy and papal support. The economic situation also deteriorated. The discovery of sea routes to India diminished the importance of Baltic trade. The Hanseatic League lost its positions, and with it, Tallinn. The Moscow Principality strengthened and transformed into a tsardom under Ivan Thias the Terrible, who had expansionist plans for the Baltic. At the same time, Sweden, Poland and Lithuania also grew stronger and laid claim to Livonian lands. In 1558, Ivan the Terrible started the Livonian War. Russian troops invaded with the aim of capturing Baltic ports for direct trade with Europe. The Order proved unable to resist. Outdated military organisation, internal religious conflicts, and financial weakness made Livonia easy prey. In the first year of the war, the Russians captured Narva and Tartu, plundering numerous settlements. The last master of the Livonian Order, Gotthard Kettler, adopted Lutheranism and in 1561 secularised the Order, transforming it into the secular Duchy of Courland under Polish protectorate. Northern Estonia appealed for help to Sweden, which willingly accepted these lands under its rule. The island of Saaremaa passed to Denmark. The Livonian state ceased to exist after 350 years of rule. The consequences of the Order period were profound. The Estonians finally lost political independence and turned into serf peasantry under German aristocracy. A linguistic and cultural gulf was established between the German-speaking elite and the Estonian population. Catholicism and later Lutheranism replaced paganism, but Christianization was often superficial, especially in rural areas. Urbanization, trade and crafts developed, but their fruits went exclusively to the German urban population. The time of the Livonian Order laid the foundations of an estate-based society that would last another 3 centuries. German baronial families that received lands during this period retained their dominant position until the 20th century. For the Estonians, the Order era became a time of loss of social status and cultural autonomy, but at the same time integration into the European economic system and gradual modernization of the economy. Sweden gained control over northern Estonia in 1561, when the Tallinn nobility requested protection from the Russian advance. Initially, this was a temporary military presence, but later, the Swedish crown officially annexed these territories. The Livonian War, 1558-1583, lasted another 2 decades, during which Estonia turned into a battlefield between Sweden, Poland, Denmark and Muscovy. Under the Treaty of Jamza-Polski in 1582, Russia renounced its claims to Livonia. The Treaty of Pleusa in 1583 secured Swedish control over northern Estonia with Tallinn. The southern part with Tartu remained under the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The island of Saaremaa was under Danish occupation until 1645, when Sweden bought it under the Treaty of Brömsebro. Swedish administration brought significant changes. Unlike the decentralized Order state, Sweden built a centralized bureaucratic system. Estonian lands received the status of a governor-generalship with its centre in Tallinn. The king-appointed governor-general managed civil administration, the judicial system, and finances. The German Baltic aristocracy retained their lands and privileges, but now submitted to the Swedish crown. King Gustav II, Adolf, 1611–1632, carried out a series of reforms aimed at strengthening royal power and limiting feudal privileges. In 1630 he established a court for land disputes. Many lands that German barons had appropriated during the Order period were recognised as royal property and confiscated. This policy, known as reduction, caused outrage among the Baltic aristocracy, but strengthened royal finances. Education became a priority for Swedish authorities. In 1632, a university, Academia Gustaviana, was founded in Tartu, the second in the Swedish Empire after Uppsala. Teaching was conducted in Latin and German, and the curriculum included theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. The university trained administrators, priests, and teachers for the provinces. Although Estonians did not have access to higher education, the university contributed to the development of intellectual life in the region. Church reform involved mass Christianization of the peasantry. By the 17th century, many Estonian peasants adhered to syncretic beliefs, combining Christianity with pagan practices. The Swedish Lutheran Church launched a systematic catechization campaign. Priests were tasked with teaching peasants to read so they could study the Bible independently. This led to an important cultural shift, the emergence of Estonian literacy. Between 1632 and 1649, catechisms, primers, and parts of the Bible were published in Estonian. The full translation of the New Testament appeared in 1686. These publications used the Latin alphabet with additional diacritical marks to convey Estonian sounds. Although the goal was religious instruction, these texts laid the foundation for the Estonian literary language. Swedish authorities also introduced elementary education for peasants. Under the law of 1686, each parish was to establish a school where children were taught reading, writing, and catechism. In practice, this network developed slowly due to lack of funds and resistance from landowners who did not want to lose labour. Nevertheless, by the end of the 17th century, literacy among the Estonian population rose from virtually zero to approximately 10–15%. The economic situation remained difficult. Constant wars depleted resources. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, although fought mainly in Germany, required Swedish provinces to supply soldiers and funds. Estonian peasants were mobilized into the Swedish army, and many died in battles on the continent. Taxes increased to finance military campaigns. Internal trade was controlled by cities. Tallinn retained its status as the main port, but lost some of its trading importance due to the overall decline of the Hanseatic League. Sweden tried to develop direct trade links, bypassing intermediaries. Exports of grain, flax, and timber went to Sweden, from where industrial goods and salt arrived. The most tragic event of the Swedish period was the famine of 1695, caused by several consecutive crop failures due to cold and wet summers. Estonia lost, according to various estimates, from 70 to 100,000 people, approximately 1/5 of the population. The northern regions were particularly affected. Peasants ate tree bark, grass, and dead livestock. Epidemics of typhus and dysentery that accompanied the famine increased mortality. The Swedish crown provided some assistance, exempting affected areas from taxes and distributing grain from royal reserves. However, the scale of the disaster exceeded the administration's capabilities. Many manorial estates were left without labour, which temporarily weakened the serfdom system. Some peasants fled to Russia or other regions in search of better conditions. The famine had long-term demographic consequences. The population recovered slowly, and by the beginning of the 18th century, Estonia still had not reached its pre-reform level. This weakened the region's economy and military potential on the eve of a new major war. Charles the Thuln, 1697 to 1718, drew Sweden into the Great Northern War, 1700–1721, against a coalition of Russia, Denmark, Saxony, and Poland. Initially, the Swedes were victorious. In 1700, Charles the Thuln defeated the Russian army at Narva in a 1.4 ratio. However, Peter the Fen reformed the army, and the situation changed. In 1709, the Swedes suffered a catastrophic defeat at Poltava. The consequences for Estonia were devastating. Russian troops invaded in 1710 and besieged Tallinn and Riga. During the war, the plague spread, killing about 1/3 of Tallinn's population. The city capitulated in September 1710. Southern Estonia, with Tartu, also came under Russian control. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 officially transferred all of Estonia to the Russian Empire. The Swedish period left an ambiguous legacy. On one hand, Sweden brought administrative modernization, educational reforms, and the beginning of Estonian literacy. Royal power limited the arbitrariness of Baltic barons through the reduction policy. The legal system became more orderly, and the church received resources for systematic work with the population. On the other hand, constant wars exhausted the country. Estonian peasants lost thousands of lives on battlefields across Europe, fighting for the interests of the Swedish crown. The economy suffered from high taxes and mobilizations. The famine of the 1690s showed the vulnerability of the agrarian system to climatic shocks. Serfdom, although somewhat limited by reforms, remained the basis of the social structure. Sweden's cultural influence proved more enduring than its political one. Lutheranism was finally established as the dominant religion. The Estonian language acquired a written form, though it was used mainly for religious texts. The educational traditions laid during this period would later become the foundation for the national awakening of the 19th century. When Russian troops entered Tallinn in 1710, the Estonians were exchanging one foreign lord for another. Peasants remained serfs, the urban German elite retained privileges, and the administrative language changed from Swedish to Russian. However, the seeds of change sown by Swedish reforms, literacy, church organization, the beginnings of national self-awareness, would sprout later when Estonians began the struggle for their own identity in the 19th century. The capitulation of Tallinn in September 1710 occurred on terms favourable to the local elite. Peter I guaranteed the Baltic Germans the preservation of their estate privileges, the Lutheran Church, land ownership, and local self-government. These guarantees, fixed in the Capitulation Acts, became the basis for the special status of the Baltic provinces in the Russian Empire for the next 200 years. Estonian lands were organised into the Estland Governorate, centred in Reval Tallinn, and partially into the Livonian Governorate, southern Estonia with Dorpat Tartu. Governors-General were appointed from St. Petersburg, but real administrative power remained in the hands of the German nobility. Landtags, estate assemblies of nobles, controlled local finances, the judicial system, and police. Peter the Young was interested in modernising the empire, but Estonia remained on the periphery. The emperor visited Reval several times, initiating the construction of shipyards and fortifications, but did not carry out systematic reforms. The main task was to ensure the loyalty of the new province and utilise its economic resources. During the reign of Anna Ivanovna, 1730-1740, the Baltic German nobility achieved significant influence at court. Many Germans from Estland and Livland made careers in the imperial administration and army. This strengthened the autonomy of the Baltic provinces. The Tsarist government effectively delegated management to the local elite in exchange for loyalty and military service. Estonian peasants remained serfs. After Swedish reforms that partially limited manorial arbitrariness, Russian authorities returned unlimited control over the peasantry to the barons. Landlords had the right to sell peasants, punish them corporally, and determine the size of corvée without state interference. Corvée grew to 5 and 6 days a week, and in some estates, peasants worked for the lord practically continuously. Catherine II, in 1762-1796, proclaimed Enlightenment ideas, but her actual policy toward the peasantry was reactionary. In 1765, an imperial decree allowed landlords throughout the empire to exile peasants to hard labour without trial. In the Baltic provinces, this decree was rarely applied due to traditional autonomy, but it symbolised the general trend of strengthening serfdom. At the same time, Catherine supported cultural projects. Under her patronage, Tartu University, closed after the transition to Russian rule, was restored. In 1802, Emperor Alexander I officially opened the university under the name Dorpat, Imperialis, Universitas Dorpatensis. Teaching was conducted in German, with professors invited from German universities. For Estonians, access was practically closed due to the language barrier and social origin. The Napoleonic Wars affected the Baltic indirectly. The Continental Blockade, 1806, 1814, disrupted trade with Britain, hitting rival merchants. Estonian recruits participated in the War of 1812 and the Russian army's foreign campaigns. After the victory over Napoleon, Alexander I turned attention to internal reforms. The most important event was the abolition of serfdom in the Baltic provinces, the first in the empire. In 1816 in Estland, 1817 in Courland, and 1819 in Livland, peasants received personal freedom. However, the reform was half-hearted. Peasants became personally free, but the land remained the property of landlords. Peasants were forced to rent plots or work under contract, which in practice differed little from serfdom. The law provided for a long transitional period. Peasants could move from one landlord to another, but only with permission, and after fulfilling all obligations. Landlords retained judicial power over peasants until the 1860s. Rent payments were often so high that peasants remained in debt and dependent on the lords. The reform had unexpected consequences. Thousands of peasants, dissatisfied with the conditions, began migrating. Some went to cities, seeking work in manufactories and ports. Others migrated deep into Russia, to the Caucasus, the Samara Governorate, and later to Siberia. The Tsarist government encouraged resettlement for colonizing the empire's peripheries. Thus, Estonian settlements emerged in Crimea and the Far East. The Industrial Revolution slowly reached Estonia. In the 1830s or 1840s, textile manufactories and flax processing enterprises appeared in Tallinn and Narva. Shipping developed. Rival shipyards built merchant vessels for Baltic trade. However, industrialization lagged behind Western Europe due to a lack of capital and skilled labour. In 1870, construction of the Baltic Railway began, connecting Tallinn with St. Petersburg. In 1876, the Tallinn-Paldiski line opened, and in 1877 the Tallinn-Tartu line. The railway revolutionized the economy. Transport costs decreased, trade turnover increased, and new jobs emerged. Tallinn transformed into an important transit port for exports from internal Russian governorates. Enlightenment ideas spread among the Baltic German elite. At Tartu University, professors taught Kant's philosophy, natural sciences and history. Some of them were interested in the Estonian language and folklore as objects of scientific study. In 1838, the learned Estonian society, Gelehrte Estnische Gesellschaft, was founded, which collected Estonian folk songs, tales, and studied the language. These studies had a dual character. On one hand, German scholars romanticized Estonian folk culture as authentic and primitive. On the other hand, they maintained a paternalistic attitude toward Estonians as objects of study, not equal partners. Nevertheless, this work created a base for the future Estonian national movement. The activity of Friedrich Robert Fehlmann was particularly important. In the 1820s, he opened the first schools for Estonian peasants at his own expense. He published textbooks, a grammar, and reading collections in Estonian. Fehlmann believed that educating peasants would improve their material situation and morality. Although his initiatives did not receive widespread support from landlords, they demonstrated the possibility of Estonian secular literature. Religious movements also played a role. In the 1840s, mass conversions to orthodoxy spread among Estonian peasants. About 65,000 Estonians converted from Lutheranism to the Orthodox Church, hoping for better living conditions under the Tsar's patronage. The Tsarist government and Orthodox Church encouraged these conversions, seeing them as a tool for Russification and weakening the influence of the German Lutheran Church. However, expectations were not met. Peasants did not receive the promised lands and benefits. Many became disillusioned and inwardly remained Lutherans, adhering only to external Orthodox rituals. This episode showed the growing dissatisfaction of the peasantry and their readiness to seek radical changes. The Crimean War, 1853-1856, demonstrated the backwardness of the Russian Empire. The British fleet blockaded Baltic ports and shelled fortresses. Tallinn was fortified, but no serious battles occurred. The defeat in the war forced the new Emperor Alexander II to realise the need for large-scale reforms. By the end of the 1850s, the economic and social situation in Estonia was characterised by contradictions. Literacy among peasants grew to 50-60% of men could read in Estonian. The first Estonian intellectuals emerged, educated in parish schools and seminaries. The economy modernised, but peasants remained landless tenants. German barons retained political and economic power, but their cultural hegemony began to weaken. Russian authorities balanced between the German elite and Estonian peasantry. On one hand, the empire relied on the loyalty of the Baltic nobility, which supplied officers and officials. On the other hand, mass peasant dissatisfaction created a potential threat to stability. The abolition of serfdom in Russia itself in 1861 raised the question of land reform in the Baltic provinces. The year 1860 became a symbolic boundary. The era of absolute landlord domination was coming to an end. Estonians gained access to education, their language began to be used in printed publications, and national consciousness was forming. Ahead lay the period of national awakening, which would forever change the social structure of the region. The 1860s became a turning point for Estonian national identity. The major reforms of Alexander II, the abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1861, the judicial reform of 1864, the Zemstvo reform of 1864, created space for social changes. In the Baltic provinces, these reforms had specifics due to the preserved privileges of the German nobility. But the overall trend was irreversible. The land reform in the Estland Governorate in 1863 and in the Livonian Governorate in 1866 allowed peasants to buy land. The state provided loans for purchasing plots from landlords. The process proceeded slowly due to high prices and complex legal procedures, but by the 1880s about 20% of Estonian peasants became landowners. This created a layer of prosperous farmers who had an economic base to support cultural initiatives. Industrialization accelerated after the construction of railways. Tallinn transformed into an industrial centre with textile factories, machine-building plants, and shipyards. In 1870, the Kreenholm textile complex in Narva opened, one of the largest in the Russian Empire, employing over 10,000 workers. Some Estonian peasants moved to cities, forming the working class. Urbanization changed the demographic balance of cities. By the mid-19th century, Tallinn and Tartu were predominantly German-speaking. By 1897, according to the first all-imperial census, Estonians made up 70% of Tallinn's population. German merchants and officials retained economic power, but the numerical superiority of Estonians created a basis for political demands. A key figure in the national awakening was Carl Robert Jacobson, 1841-1882. He founded the newspaper Sakala in 1878, which became the mouthpiece of the Estonian national movement. Jacobson criticised the privileges of the Baltic barons, called for agrarian reform and equality for the Estonian language. His articles formulated a programme of social transformations, access for Estonians to higher education, the right to political participation, and fair land distribution. Johan Voldemar Jansen, 1819-1890, laid the foundations of Estonian journalism. In 1857, he founded the newspaper Pärnu Postimees, the first long-lasting Estonian newspaper. Jansen also organised the first all-Estonian song festival in 1869 in Tartu, where about 800 singers and several thousand spectators gathered. The festival became a symbol of the cultural unity of Estonians. Song festivals turned into the most important instrument of national mobilisation. The second festival in 1879 in Tallinn gathered already 5,000 participants. They sang Estonian folk songs, patriotic hymns, and choral classics. The festivals demonstrated the cultural capability of the Estonian nation and created emotional bonds between participants from different regions. By 1914, 5 all-Estonian song festivals had taken place. Literature played a central role in shaping national consciousness. Friedrich Reinhold Kreutzwald, 1803–1882, created the national epic Kalevipoeg, published between 1857 to 1861. The epic was based on Estonian folk legends about the hero giant Kalevipoeg, who fights enemies and builds the Estonian state. Although the work was a literary adaptation of folklore modelled after the Finnish Kalevala, it became a symbol of Estonian historical tradition and cultural distinctiveness. Literature in the Estonian language developed rapidly. The lyrics of Lydia Koidula, 1843–1886, Janssen's daughter, introduced romantic and patriotic motifs. Her poems expressed longing for lost freedom and hope for national revival. Koidula also wrote plays for the Estonian theatre, which evolved from amateur troupes in parish halls. Education became a field of struggle. Until the 1880s, primary schools in rural areas taught in Estonian, but secondary education remained German-speaking. Estonians demanded gymnasiums with Estonian language instruction and access to university. Russian authorities supported these demands as a way to weaken the influence of Baltic Germans. In the 1880s, the policy of Russification began under the reign of Alexander III. The Russian language became mandatory in administration and courts in the Baltic provinces. In 1889, Tartu University switched to Russian language instruction instead of German. Many German professors resigned or emigrated. For Estonians, this was a paradox. Russification weakened German hegemony, but imposed new language restrictions. Estonian intellectuals divided in their attitude toward Russification. Some considered an alliance with Russian authorities against the Germans the lesser evil. Others saw Russification as a threat to Estonian cultural autonomy. Jan Tõnisson, 1868–1941, a future political leader, advocated for compromise, loyalty to the empire in exchange for cultural rights for Estonians. The economic growth at the end of the 19th century created an Estonian bourgeoisie. Estonian entrepreneurs emerged, owners of mills, sawmills and small factories. They financed cultural projects, theatres, libraries, publishing houses. Societies like Virumavate Selts and others organised lectures, concerts and exhibitions. The workers' movement gained strength. Industrialisation created concentrations of workers in large enterprises. Working conditions were harsh: 12 to 14-hour workdays, low wages, lack of social security. The first strikes occurred at the Kreenholm manufactory in 1872 and 1882. Workers demanded a shorter workday and higher wages. The Revolution of 1905 became the culmination of social contradictions. Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg on January 9, 1905, triggered a chain reaction of strikes throughout the empire. In January-February, mass strikes in Tallinn and Narva paralysed industry. Workers demanded political freedoms, an 8-hour workday and voting rights. In the summer and fall of 1905, the movement spread to the countryside. Peasants attacked manorial estates, burned economic buildings, and demanded land transfer. The Livland governorate suffered the most. According to various estimates, over 180 estates were destroyed or damaged. Punitive expeditions by Tsarist troops brutally suppressed the uprising. Hundreds of participants were shot, thousands exiled to Siberia. The revolution of 1905 accelerated the politicization of Estonian society. Political parties and organizations emerged. Moderate liberals led by Jan Tõnisson founded the Progress Party, which advocated for constitutional monarchy and autonomy for the Baltic provinces. More radical groups sympathized with socialist ideas. The Estonian Social Democratic Workers' Union, founded in 1905, had a Marxist orientation. The manifesto of October 17, 1905, promised civil freedoms and the State Duma. Baltic Estonians received representation in the Duma, though limited due to the curial electoral system. Estonian deputies used the Duma platform to criticise Baltic privileges and demand land reform. The Stolypin agrarian reform of 1906-1911 allowed peasants to leave communes and create private farms. In the Baltic provinces, the reform had less impact since communal land ownership was atypical, but it stimulated further purchase of land by peasants from landlords. By 1914, about 40% of Estonian peasants owned their own land. On the eve of the First World War, Estonian society was deeply differentiated. There was an Estonian intelligentsia, teachers, journalists, doctors, lawyers who had obtained higher education in Russian universities. A national bourgeoisie with economic resources was forming. The working class acquired political consciousness. Peasants, though becoming free owners or tenants, retained deep distrust of landlords. Cultural infrastructure developed, Estonian theatres operated, dozens of newspapers and magazines were published in Estonian. Cultural societies worked in every county. Literacy reached 90–95% of the population, the highest rate in the Russian Empire. The Estonian language had a standardized literary form, dictionaries and grammars. But political independence remained a distant prospect. Estonians had not had their own statehood for 700 years. The national movement formulated cultural and social demands, not a separatist program. Most Estonian leaders saw the future within the framework of autonomy in a democratized Russia. The World War that began in the summer of 1914 would radically change these calculations and open unexpected opportunities for gaining independence. The First World War began for Estonia in August 1914 with mobilization into the Russian army. Tens of thousands of Estonians went to the front, fighting mainly against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Estonian political leaders supported the empire's war efforts, hoping that loyalty would be rewarded after the war with expanded autonomy. The February Revolution of 1917 radically changed the situation. The abdication of Nicholas II and the fall of the monarchy created an opportunity for national demands. In April 1917, the provisional government allowed the unification of the Estonian parts of the Estland and Northern Livland governorates into a single administrative unit centred in Tallinn. This was the first step toward territorial consolidation of the Estonian nation. Estonians formed self-governing bodies. The Mapev, Land Council, a representative body with 62 deputies, began work in July 1917. Jan Poska became the head of the executive committee, effectively the prime minister. Estonians gained control over local administration, education, and police, but remained part of Russia. The October Bolshevik coup in November 1917 posed a dilemma for Estonian leaders. The Bolsheviks proclaimed the right of nations to self-determination, but in practice sought to establish Soviet power everywhere. In Tallinn, the Bolsheviks, supported by the Baltic fleet and workers, seized power. The Mapeyev was dissolved by the Red Guard. The German offensive at the beginning of 1918 shifted the balance of power. After the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between Germany and Bolshevik Russia in March 1918, German troops occupied Estonia. The Bolsheviks retreated. On February 24, 1918, the last day before the German occupation, Estonian leaders proclaimed the independence of the Estonian Republic. The manifesto was read in Tallinn before a small group of people and printed in newspapers. The German occupation lasted until November 1918. The Germans did not recognise Estonian independence and attempted to create a puppet Baltic state under the control of Baltic Germans. The Estonian provisional government, led by Konstantin Pets, operated underground, preparing armed forces and diplomatic support. After Germany's capitulation on November 11, 1918, the Estonian government emerged from underground. The formation of a regular army began. but on November 22nd, 1918, Soviet Russia launched an offensive attempting to establish communist power. The War of Independence, 1918 to 1920, began. Soviet troops advanced quickly through Estonian territory. By the end of 1918, they controlled most of the country, including Tartu and Narva. The Estonian army, which initially numbered only a few thousand fighters, suffered defeats. The government prepared to evacuate Tallinn. The turning point was the counter-offensive in January 1919. Estonian troops, reinforced by Finnish volunteers and supported by the British fleet, which supplied weapons, repelled the Bolsheviks. By February 1919, the entire territory of Estonia was liberated. Estonians even conducted raids into Soviet Russian territory, capturing Pskov. Throughout 1919, the Estonian army fought on several fronts. In the south, in Latvia, Estonians helped the Latvians against the German Landeswehr and the Russian White Army of General Yudenich. In the east, battles with the Bolsheviks continued. In October 1919, Yudenich, using Estonian territory as a base, launched an offensive on Petrograd but was defeated. The Estonian government refused to support Yudenich as the White Army did not recognise Estonian independence. This position caused outrage among the White Guards and their Western allies, but proved strategically correct. When the White Army was defeated, the Estonians negotiated with the Bolsheviks as an independent party. The Tartu Peace Treaty, signed on February 2, 1920, ended the war. Soviet Russia recognised Estonia's independence forever and renounced territorial claims. Estonia gained control over a territory of 47,349 km² with a population of about 1.1 million. The treaty also provided for Russian compensation of 15 million gold rubles. The young republic faced enormous challenges. The war claimed about 5,000 lives, the economy was devastated and infrastructure damaged. Over 40,000 Estonians remained refugees in Russia. But independence created the opportunity for radical reforms. The agrarian reform of 1919 became the boldest transformation. The government expropriated the lands of Baltic German barons without compensation. About 200 large estates were divided and transferred to 56,000 landless peasants and veterans of the War of Independence. Each family received 20-30 hectares of land. This destroyed the centuries-old social structure in a few months. The reform had not only economic but also symbolic significance. It liquidated the social structure that had existed for 700 years. German barons lost the economic base of their power. Many emigrated to Germany. Estonia transformed into a country of small farmer owners, creating a broad base for democracy. The constitution, adopted in 1920, established a parliamentary republic with a unicameral parliament, Riigikogu, of 100 deputies. The president had primarily ceremonial functions, with real power belonging to the prime minister and government. The proportional representation electoral system allowed even small parties to gain seats in parliament. Such a system led to political fragmentation. During the 1920s, 20 to 30 political parties operated. None had an absolute majority, so governments were formed by coalitions. Between 1919 and 1933, 20 governments changed. On average, each lasted 8 months. Political instability complicated long-term planning. The economy of the 1920s grew rapidly. The basis was agricultural products, butter, bacon, grain, exported to Great Britain and Germany. The shale industry developed in northeastern Estonia. Shale was used as fuel for power, plants and raw material for the chemical industry. By 1930, Estonia produced about 1.5 million tons of shale per year. The textile industry, concentrated in Tallinn and Narva, worked for export. The pulp and paper industry utilised abundant forest resources. Shipyards built vessels for the merchant fleet. Although Estonia remained primarily an agrarian country, 60% of the population lived in villages, industrialisation gradually gained momentum. culture experienced a flourishing. Tartu University, restored as an Estonian educational institution in 1919, trained national cadres. Estonian writers, artists, and composers of international level emerged. Anton Hansen Tammsaar wrote the epic novel Truth and Justice, 1926-1933, which explored the moral dilemmas of Estonian society. The Great Depression of 1929 to 1933 hit Estonia hard. Prices for agricultural products fell by 50–70%, striking at the basis of the economy. Unemployment in cities rose to 20–25%. Exports halved. The government introduced strict austerity measures, reduced salaries for civil servants, and cut social spending. The economic crisis undermined trust in democracy. Right-wing nationalist movements gained popularity. The VAPS, Eesti Vabadusõjalaste Liit, a movement of veterans of the War of Independence, demanded strong executive power and restrictions on parliamentarism. In 1933, a referendum approved constitutional reform that provided for the introduction of a presidential system with broad powers. Konstantin Päts, Prime Minister during the crisis, feared that the VAPs would come to power and establish an authoritarian regime modelled after Mussolini. On March 12, 1934, Päts carried out a coup d'état, declaring a state of emergency. He banned the VAPs and other political organisations, introduced press censorship, and postponed elections. Päts' authoritarian regime, 1934–1940, ended democracy, but preserved most civil rights. There were no mass repressions. Political opponents mostly received short prison terms or forced emigration. The economy stabilised thanks to state intervention and the devaluation of the kroon, which increased export competitiveness. In 1938, Päts adopted a new constitution that formally restored democratic institutions but concentrated real power in the hands of the president. He became the first president under the new constitution, elected not by popular vote but by a special college. Parliament had limited powers. Estonia's international position deteriorated. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union strengthened. Estonia tried to pursue a policy of neutrality, signing non-aggression pacts with both regimes. The Baltic Entente, 1934, an agreement between Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, had limited influence due to small military capabilities. On the eve of the Second World War, Estonia had a functioning economy, an educated population and developed infrastructure. But its geopolitical location between two totalitarian states made it vulnerable. The Molotov–Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, secretly assigned Estonia to the Soviet sphere of influence. Independence, achieved with such effort 20 years earlier, was under threat of destruction. The secret protocol of the Molotov–Ribbentrop Pact of August 23, 1939, determined Estonia's fate. The Soviet Union gained the right to a sphere of interests in the Baltic region. Already in September 1939, the USSR forced the Estonian government to sign a mutual assistance pact, allowing the placement of Soviet military bases on Estonian territory. 25,000 Soviet soldiers entered the country. On June 17, 1940, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum: change the government and allow an unlimited number of Soviet troops. Estonia had no means to resist. President Päts accepted the demands, hoping to avoid bloodshed. The next day, Soviet troops occupied the entire country. The number of occupation troops reached 90,000, more than the entire Estonian army. Soviet advisors organised a puppet government led by the leftist poet Johannes Vares. In July, rigged elections were held for the State Duma, where the only list was the Union of the Working People. The official result showed 92% support. The new Duma unanimously voted for accession to the USSR. On August 6, 1940, Estonia became the Estonian SSR within the Soviet Union. Mass repressions began. Over 2,000 people were arrested. Political leaders, military officers, entrepreneurs, intellectuals. President Peasant was deported to Russia, where he died in a psychiatric hospital in 1956. Prime Minister Jurij Ulutz fled to Sweden. Many arrested were executed, others sent to the Gulag. On June 14, 1941, a mass deportation took place. In one night, the NKVD deported about 10,000 Estonians to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Class enemies, former politicians, landowners, entrepreneurs, as well as their families, including women and children, were subject to deportation. Many died during transportation in freight cars or in the first months at special settlements. On June 22, 1941, Germany attacked the USSR. German troops quickly advanced through the Baltic region. By September, all of Estonia was under German occupation. Some Estonians perceived the Germans as liberators from Soviet terror. Estonian volunteers assisted the German army, hoping for the restoration of independence. The German occupation administration quickly dispelled these hopes. Estonia was incorporated into the Reichskommissariat Ostland under the leadership of Heinrich Lohse. The Germans did not recognize Estonian self-government and viewed the country as territory for colonization. The General Plan East envisioned Germanization of the Baltic and deportation or extermination of the local population. The Nazi regime organized the Holocaust on Estonian territory. Before June 1941, about 4,500 Jews lived in Estonia. Most were killed by the end of 1941. Estonia was also used as a site for mass executions of Jews deported from other occupied territories. In concentration camps on Estonian soil, over 10,000 people perished, mainly Jews from Lithuania, Latvia, and other countries. The Germans mobilized Estonians into auxiliary military formations. The Estonian SS Legion and other units fought on the Eastern Front against the Red Army. Some fought voluntarily, others were conscripted forcibly. Mobilization in 1943 and 1944 encompassed about 70,000 Estonians. Many died in battles on the Narva front in the summer of 1944. In the fall of 1944, the Red Army returned. German troops retreated, and Estonia was again under Soviet occupation. About 70,000 Estonians evacuated to Sweden and Germany, fleeing Soviet revenge. An Estonian diaspora formed in Western Europe, Canada, Australia, and the USA. The partisan movement of the Forest Brothers began immediately after the return of Soviet power. Thousands of Estonians went into the forests, forming armed groups. They attacked Soviet administrative institutions, communication lines, and local party committees. The most active resistance lasted until 1949. Soviet punitive detachments and the NKVD suppressed the partisans through large-scale sweep operations. The second major deportation occurred on March 25, 1949. Under Operation Preboy, about 20,000 Estonians were deported to Siberia. The goal was to destroy the social base of the partisans, prosperous peasants who supported the resistance with food and information. Collectivization of agriculture was completed by 1950, destroying the private farming created by the agrarian reform of 1919. In total, during the Soviet occupations of 1940, 1941 and 1944-1953, about 30,000 Estonians were deported. Thousands died in battles, from hunger and disease in camps. The repressions affected practically every Estonian family. These events were deeply ingrained in collective memory and became the basis for anti-Soviet sentiments. After Stalin's death in 1953, the thaw began. Nikita Khrushchev condemned Stalin's cult of personality in 1956, allowing partial rehabilitation of repression victims. Deported Estonians were permitted to return, though many had nowhere to go. Their homes were occupied by Russian-speaking settlers. In the 1950s-1960s, mass industrialization took place. Soviet authorities built large enterprises, machine-building factories, chemical plants, power stations. Estonian industry was integrated into the all-union economy. Shale extraction developed. By the 1980s, production reached 30 million tons per year, providing 70% of the republic's electricity. Industrialization was accompanied by mass migration of labor from other Soviet republics, mainly from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. By 1989, the share of Estonians in the population decreased to 61% from 88% in 1934. In the northeastern industrial cities of Narva and Kohtla-Järve, Estonians were a minority. This created tension and fears of assimilation. Cultural policy was contradictory. On one hand, the Estonian language retained official status in the Republic, with Estonian schools, theatres, and books operating. On the other, there was strict censorship, a ban on contacts with the diaspora, and Russification of higher education. Many Estonian intellectuals emigrated or were repressed. In the 1970s, the USSR economy began to stagnate, but Estonia remained a relatively prosperous republic. The standard of living was higher than in most Union republics. Trade ties with Finland through Tallinn provided access to Western goods. Finnish television, which could be watched in northern Estonia, became a window to the West. Economic experiments in the second half of the 1970s allowed Estonian enterprises greater autonomy. Estonia became a place where market mechanisms were tested within the planned economy. However, these reforms were limited and did not solve the systemic problems of the Soviet economy. Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika policy, started in 1985, created space for national movements. In 1987, the first mass protest in Tallinn occurred against plans for phosphorite mining that threatened ecological catastrophe. This became the beginning of the Singing Revolution, a peaceful movement for independence. In 1988, a song festival in Tallinn gathered 300,000 people who sang banned national songs and demanded independence. The Estonian Popular Front, created in the fall of 1988, united intellectuals, reformers in the Communist Party, and broad masses of the population. Edgar Savisaar became its head. On November 16, 1988, the Supreme Soviet of the Estonian SSR adopted the Declaration of Sovereignty, proclaiming the supremacy of Estonian laws over Union ones. This was the first step towards separation. On August 23, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, about 2 million people from the 3 Baltic republics formed a human chain from Tallinn to Vilnius, 600 kilometers long, the Baltic Way. In 1990, free elections to the Supreme Soviet took place. Pro-Western forces gained a majority. On May 8, 1990, the Estonian name of the republic changed from Estonian SSR to Estonian Republic, restoring the link to the pre-war state. The period of restoration of independence began. The attempted state coup in Moscow in August 1991 accelerated the process. On August 20, 1991, during the putsch, the Supreme Soviet proclaimed the full restoration of independence. After the putsch's failure, Western states began recognizing Estonian independence. Russia recognized it on September 6, 1991. The transition to a market economy was shock therapy. Prime Minister Mart Laar, who came to power in 1992 at the age of 32, implemented radical liberal reforms. A national currency, the Estonian kroon, pegged to the German mark, was introduced. Privatization of state enterprises occurred quickly through a voucher system. The economic reforms created difficulties. Unemployment rose. Many Soviet enterprises closed as uncompetitive. The Russian-speaking population, concentrated in industrial sectors, suffered particularly. Social tension grew, but the government refrained from populist measures, maintaining fiscal discipline. The 1992 citizenship law granted automatic citizenship only to those who were citizens of pre-war Estonia and their descendants. Soviet settlers had to naturalize by passing exams in Estonian language and history. About 30% of the population became stateless. Russia and international organizations criticized this policy, but the Estonian government insisted on legal succession to the pre-war republic. foreign policy was oriented toward integration into Western structures. Estonia applied for NATO membership in 1994 and the European Union in 1995. Negotiations lasted nearly a decade. On March 29, 2004, Estonia became a NATO member. On May 1, 2004, a member of the EU. This was perceived as the final return to Europe and a guarantee of security from Russia. The economy grew rapidly in the late 1990s and early 2000s. GDP increased by 8 to 10% per year. Estonia became a leader in information technology. The program Skype, developed here, became a global phenomenon. E-governance, digital signatures, and electronic voting made Estonia one of the most digitized societies in the world. The financial crisis of 2008 hit Estonia hard. The economy contracted by 14% in 2009, one of the worst indicators in the EU. Unemployment rose from 4% to 16%. The booming construction sector collapsed. But the government did not devalue the currency and avoided debt borrowing. Strict austerity policies reduced the budget deficit. Such a strategy proved successful. By 2011, Estonia restored growth and met the Maastricht criteria for Eurozone entry. On January 1, 2011, the kroon was replaced by the euro. Estonia became the first post-Soviet republic to adopt the single European currency. By 2010, Estonia had transformed into a successful European country with a democratic system, high-tech economy, and integration into Western structures. The population decreased from 1.5 million in 1990 to 1.3 million due to emigration and low birth rates, but quality of life rose sharply. The divide between Estonian and Russian-speaking populations remained a problem, but gradually diminished through integration programs. Estonia's historical path from occupations to independence and prosperity demonstrates the resilience of a nation that survived the worst cataclysms of the 20th century. Hunger, deportations, occupations did not destroy Estonian identity. When the historical chance appeared in 1991, Estonians seized it decisively, implementing radical reforms despite difficulties. It exceeded expectations. In 2 decades, an agrarian Soviet republic turned into a digital democracy with a high standard of living. The country, conquered for centuries, finally controlled its own fate. Membership in NATO and the EU guaranteed the security that Estonians had been deprived of for 700 years. However, the memory of lost decades, of the deported, of those who died in the struggle for freedom, remained alive, as a reminder of the price of independence and a warning against complacency in a changing geopolitical world.